Hello everyone, today we read and comment the ninth chapter of the fourth book of von Clausewitz Vom Kriege, the title being The Battle, Its Decision, the Entscheidungsschlacht. The text follows. What is a battle? A conflict of the main body, but not an unimportant one, about a secondary object, not a mere attempt which is given up when we see betimes that our object is hardly within our reach. It is a conflict waged with all our forces for the attainment of a decisive victory. Minor objects may also be mixed up with the principal object, and it will take many different tones of color from the circumstances out of which it originates, for a battle belongs also to a greater whole of which it is only a part. But because the essence of war is conflict, and the battle is the conflict of the main armies, it is always to be regarded as the real center of gravity of the war, and therefore its distinguishing character is that, unlike all other encounters, it is arranged for and undertaken with the sole purpose of obtaining a decisive victory. This has an influence on the manner of its decision, on the effect of the victory contained in it, and determines the value which theory is to assign to it as a means to an end. On that account we make it the subject of our special consideration, and this stage before we enter upon the special ends which may be bound up with it, but which do not essentially alter its character if it really deserves to be termed a battle. If a battle takes place principally on its own account, the elements of its decision must be contained in itself. In other words, victory must be striven for as long as possibly or hope remains. It must not, therefore, be given up on account of secondary circumstances, but only and alone in the event of the forces appearing completely insufficient. Now, how is that precise moment to be described? If a certain artificial formation and cohesion of an army is the principal condition under which the bravery of the troops can gain a victory, as was the case during a great part of the period of the modern art of war, then the breaking up of this formation is the decision. A bitten wing which is put out of joint decides the fate of all that was connected with it. If, as was the case at another time, the essence of the defense consists in an intimate alliance of the army with the ground on which it fights and its obstacles, so that army and position are only one, then the conquest of an essential point in this position is the decision. It is said the key of the position is lost, it cannot therefore be defended by any further. The battle cannot be continued. In both cases, the beaten armies are very much like the broken strings of an instrument which cannot do their work. That geometrical as well as this geographical principle which had a tendency to place an army in a state of crystallizing tension, which did not allow their available powers being made use of up to the last man, have at least so far lost their influence that they no longer predominate. Armies are still led into battle in a certain order, but that order is no longer of decisive importance. Obstacles of ground are also still turned to account to strengthen a position, but they are no longer the only support. We attempted in the second chapter of this book to take a general view of the nature of the modern battle. According to our conception of it, the order of battle is only a disposition of the forces suitable to the convenient use of them, and the course of the battle a mutual slow wearing away of these forces upon one another, to see which will have soonest exhausted his adversary. The resolution, therefore, to give up the fight arises in a battle more than in any other combat, from the relation of the fresh reserves remaining available. For only these still retain all their moral vigor, and the cinders of the battered, knocked about battalions, already burnt out in the destroying element, must not be placed on a level with them. Also lost ground, as we have elsewhere said, is the standard of lost moral force. It therefore comes also into account, but as a sign of loss suffered than for the loss itself, and the number of fresh reserves is always the chief point to be looked at by both commanders. In general, an action inclines in one direction from the very commencement, but in a manner little observable. This direction is also frequently given in a very decided manner by the arrangements which have been made previously and then it shows a want of discernment in that general who commences battle under these unfavorable circumstances without being aware of them. Even when this doesn't occur, it lies in the nature of things that the course of battle resembles rather a slow disturbance of equilibrium, which commences soon, but as we have said, almost imperceptibly at first, and then with each moment of time becomes stronger and more visible than an oscillating to and fro, as those who are misled by mendacious descriptions usually suppose. But whether it happens that the balance is for a long time little disturbed, or that even after it has been lost on one side it rights itself again, and is then lost on the other side, it is certain that at all events that in most instances the defeated general foresees his fate long before he retreats, and that cases in which some critical event acts with unexpected force upon the course of the war have their existence mostly in the coloring with which every one depicts his lost battle. We can only here appeal to the decision of unprejudiced men of experience who will, we are sure, assent to what we have said, and answer for us to such of our readers as do not know war from their own experience. To develop the necessity of discourse from the nature of the thing would lead us far into the province of tactics, to which this branch of the subject belongs. We are here only concerned with its results. If we say that the defeated general foresees the unfavorable result, usually some time before he makes up his mind to give up the battle, we admit that there are also instances to the contrary, because otherwise we should maintain a proposition contradictory in itself. If at the moment of each decisive tendency of a battle it should be considered as lost, then also no further forces should be used to give it a turn, and consequently this decisive tendency could not precede the retreat by any length of time. Certainly there are instances of battles which, after having taken a decided turn to one side, have still ended in favor of the other. But they are rare, not usual. These exceptional cases, however, are reckoned upon by every general against whom fortune declares itself, and he must reckon upon them as long as there remains a possibility of a turn of fortune. He hopes by stronger force, by raising the remaining moral forces, by surpassing himself, or also by some fortunate chance that the next moment will bring a change, and pursues this as far as his courage and his judgment can agree. We shall have something more to say on this subject, but before that we must show what are the signs of the scales turning. The results of the whole combat consists in the sum total of the results of all partial combats, but these results of separate combats are settled by different considerations. First of all, by the pure moral power in the mind of the leading officers. If a general of division has seen his battalion's force to succumb, it will have an influence on his demeanor and his reports, and these again will have an influence on the measures of the commander-in-chief. Therefore, even those unsuccessful partial combats which to all appearance are retrieved are not lost in their results, and the impressions from them sum themselves up in the mind of the commander without much trouble, and even against his will. Secondly, by the quicker melting away of our troops, which can be easily estimated in the slow and relative little tumultuary course of our battles. Thirdly, by lost ground. All these things serve for the eye of the general as a compass to tell, of course, of the course of the battle in which he is embarked. If whole batteries have been lost to none of the enemy's taken, if battalions have been overthrown by the enemy's cavalry, whilst those of the enemy everywhere present impenetrable masses, if the line of fire from his order of battle wavers involuntarily from one point to another, if fruitless efforts have been made to gain certain points, and the assaulting battalions each time being scattered by well-directed volleys of grape in case, if our artillery begins to reply feebly to that of the enemy, if the battalions under fire diminish unusually fast, because with the wounded crowds of unwounded men go to the rear, if single divisions have been cut off and made prisoners through the disruption of the plan of the battle, if the line of retreat begins to be endangered, the commander may tell very well in which direction he is going with his battle. The longer his direction continues, the more decided it becomes. So much the more difficult will be the turning, so much the nearer the moment when he must give up the battle. We shall now make some observations on this moment. We have already said that that the final decision is ruled mostly by the relative number of fresh reserves remaining at the last, that commander who sees his adversary is decidedly superior to him in this respect makes up his mind to retreat. It is the characteristic of the modern battles that all mischances and losses which take place in the course of the same can be retrieved by fresh ones, because the arrangement of the modern order of battle and the way in which troops are brought into action allow the arrangement of their use almost generally and in each position. So long, therefore, as the commander against whom the issue seems to declare itself still remains a superiority in reserve force, he will not give up the day. But from the moment that these reserves begin to become weaker than his enemies, the decision may be regarded as settled, and what he now does depends partly on special circumstances, partly on the degree of courage and the perseverance which he personally possesses, and which may degenerate into foolish obstinacy. How a commander can attain to the power of estimating correctly the still remaining reserves on both sides is an affair of skillful practical genius, which does not in any way belong to this place. We keep ourselves to the result as it forms itself in his mind. But his conclusion is still not the moment of decision properly, for a motive which only arises gradually does not answer that, but is only a general motive towards resolution, and the resolution itself requires still some special immediate causes. Of these there are two chief ones which constantly recur, that is, the danger of retreat and the arrival of the night. If the retreat with every new step which the battle takes in its course becomes constantly in greater danger, and if the reserves are so much diminished that they are no longer adequate to get breathing room, then there is nothing left but to submit to fate, and by a well-conducted retreat to save what by a longer delay ending in flight and disaster would be lost. But night, as a rule, puts an end to all battles, because at night combat holds out no hope of advantage except under particular circumstances. And as night is better suited for a retreat than the day, so therefore the commander who must look at the retreat as a thing inevitable or as most probable will prefer to make use of the night for his purpose. That there are besides the above two usual and chief causes, yet many others also which are less or more individual and not to be overlooked, is a matter of course. For the more a battle tends towards a complete upset of equilibrium, the more sensible is the influence of each partial result in hastening the turn. Thus, the loss of a battery, a successful charge of a couple of regiments of cavalry may call into life the resolution to retreat already ripening. As a conclusion to this subject, we must dwell for a moment on the point at which the courage of the commander engages in a sort of conflict with his reason. If on the one hand the overbearing pride of a victorious conqueror, if the inflexible will of a naturally obstinate spirit is the strenuous resistance of noble feelings will not yield the battlefield, where they must leave their honor, yet on the other hand reason counsels not to give up everything, not to risk the last upon the game, but to retain as much over as is necessary for an orderly retreat. However highly we must esteem courage and firmness in war, and however little prospect there is of victory, to him who cannot resolve to seek it by the exertion of all his power, still there is a point beyond which perseverance can only be termed desperate folly, and therefore can meet with no approbation from any critic. In the most celebrated of all battles, that of Belle Alliance, Bonaparte used his last reserve in an effort to retrieve a battle which was past being retrieved. He spent his last farthing, and then, as a beggar, abandoned both the battlefield and his crown. So, very long and important chapter on the decisive battle, and fundamentally on the characteristics that these battles have, how to recognize one, and how to handle it in many ways, and how it unfolds, given the character of the modern battle that von Clausewitz has previously described, that, as always, shouldn't be understood just like an early 19th century, a Napoleonic era battle, right? Decisive battle, but rather part of a. It's even wrong to think it in an evolutionary sense, right, of warfare, but properly in a scale that, in many ways, has kept heading right in the same direction up to our day, right, and that can resemble actually easily, aside from the change in in tactics and weaponry and so on. After all, the same battle we know today, right? This character of scale, maybe I hope I have explained it well enough in the relative video, but here has probably to do with, as you understand, let's say, the growth, a complexive growth of the war, right? The idea that these battles are ever more complex and complicated affairs on an ever larger scale, even quantitatively speaking, and also in amount of forces involved, that fundamentally fluidify and virtually erase like this concept of a prearranged characteristic of the army, or the ground where the battle is properly fought, as the determining aspect to look at in order to handle it, right, and rather going towards the idea of this long attritional battle, also in many ways in open ground, or at least properly in a pitched battle, that overall is somewhat flexible in the various elements that are employed, various forces are employed during the fight. Von Clausewitz stresses the importance of reserves in this regard, and in this chapter focuses specifically on understanding where's the balance of the battle. How do we decide fundamentally that the battle is over, right? When do we spot it? When do we realize it? And of course, von Clausewitz gives us a theoretical guide to it, but he states openly that it's actually very complicated to understand, especially before the various reserves are both sides are committed to understand where this battle is going towards the end. So this has enormous implications that von Clausewitz expressly also says we can't discuss in this specific chapter, but that are obviously connected, as he says here at the beginning, to this broader, as combat is a broader part of war, naturally, in its Schwerpunkt properly. And we will analyze that better in practice, as the combat is properly what the action of war is about. So the great decisive battle is here also tendentially, asymptotically, what it's not an abstract, but it's still a theoretical battle, right? We don't know which one is the decisive battle. We have seen even in the Clausewitzian theory how the concept of decisive battle is very debatable, right, by von Clausewitz himself. He says, there is properly not a battle that is decisive, that is not the last of the war, fundamentally. It doesn't matter how big or impacting the others have been, but as long as someone keeps on fighting, right, that it is going to properly be decisive. So here, the decisive battle is intended as towards the absolute of war, the absolute tendency of war towards which war practically should head, in spite of all the restrictions that reality poses to its full expression, let's say, or breaking out, deflagration, if we prefer, because that it's really that violent, conceptually speaking, is naturally rare to find. Right, there can be battles that work like that, but war is always an instrument of politics. So, that there could be a campaign in which, from a strictly military point of view, in terms of annihilation of the enemy forces, there isn't much, right, of it, right, in which there is no major battle. But again, this is what towards war should tend. The sooner we want to end it, right, that from a strictly military logic, not necessarily a political one, is the object of war in practice, right? Von Clausewitz says, if you truly care as a humanitarian person to spare as much lives as you can, you should head towards the most violent type of fight, right, to the decisive battle proper, so that it ends there, right? There is no continuation, dilution, and this fundamental loss in the potential regional advantage would settle the matter more quickly, right? And instead we know that every war is fundamentally fought exactly because of those limitations posed by reality, in a way that unfortunately not just is not predictable, but properly that goes on in much worse ways than what it could go, right? Given coldly and in fact realistically logic rationale of the same war. Right? This is particularly important to stress at the beginning. So starting it, try to make it quickly effective because it's long, as we're saying. So, okay, the battle is decision. So what is a battle? A conflict of the main body, right? Here Clausewitz stresses, the concept that objectively a battle can be also a bigger or smaller thing, but conceptually, the thing, as we were saying right now, should head towards the larger engagement, right? And in fact, Von Clausewitz says, a conflict of the main body, but not an unimportant one about a secondary object, right? Not a mere what is a secondary object, by the way, because there are many objects all over. So here Von Clausewitz is giving, conceptually categorical, but yet fictitious separation between what is a primary object and a secondary one. It's sometimes even difficult to determine, right? He's perfectly aware of that. It says, not a mere attempt, which is given up when we see betimes that our object is hardly within our reach. It is a conflict waged with all our forces for the attainment of a decisive victory, right? So here, once again, the tendency to say, okay, let's get it done today, right? Let's make it. And this is really important because many battles were fought with this idea. Think about Gettysburg, right? How the Confederates gave battle. It was the intention proper. There are actually enormous examples of this, of battles that eventually didn't turn out like that, right? As in fact, giving the American Civil War as an example. And that is a good example, in fact, properly of how the decisive battle in this regard is mostly like giving this giant push. Think about the Kaiserschlacht or the Strafexpedition, right, of the Battle of the Solstice during World War I. All these pushes of Germany and Austria-Hungary to cause a major break in the West, and that not only failed but properly it brought fundamentally to this even worsening of the condition. I mean, here it's really about the balances, strategical but political, and this eludes here, this chapter. It's tactical, merely tactical, but it makes you realize what's the general expectation that you have towards this great decisive battle, right? And this was a bit of an obsession. If you think about the Schlieffen plan, right, ending the war at the beginning, where it was major, a critical hit against the enemy, right? And this is unfortunately very rare, generally speaking. Like, I couldn't think objectively of a battle that brought to that, like, in a single blow, right? There is always something that happens before it happens later. It's not merely like a merely important function of the main battle, right? There is always a continuation in a way or another in this broader stream. Von Clausewitz says, and he concentrates, in fact, in this regard, you should invest in that, all your forces, right? Always considering properly that the enemy should be called there to fight, right? Otherwise, of course, you could simply overwhelm him, given your strategical superiority, and there are wars that are fought, in fact, also like that, and many of them actually are. But still, from the other side, there should be properly the idea also of either you fight this battle or you don't fight at all, right? This is particularly important also in general from a political, even before in strategical point of view. Clausewitz writes, minor objects may also be mixed up with a principal object. This is obvious, right? And it will take many different tones of color from the circumstances out of which it originates. For a battle belongs also to a greater wall of which it is only a part, but because the essence of war is conflict, and the battle is the conflict of the main armies, it is always to be regarded as the real center of gravity of the war. and therefore its distinguishing character is that unlike all other encounters, it is arranged for and undertaken with the sole purpose of obtaining a decisive victory. Right, so in other words, as we have already seen, we can also think, obviously, the strategy is more important than tactics. It's more complex, it's more difficult, it has bring to greater results, but yet if it doesn't, if these decisions do not pass through to tactics, there is probably no strategy either, because that's about the employment of the armed forces for the aim of combat, right? So it's all aimed to combat, and therefore conceptually strategy should point towards that direction, towards the idea of crushing the enemy in this major blow that will get rid of him, and for which you have to employ in turn also an overwhelming amount of sources over the enemy, of forces over the enemy, so that you are able to get rid of him in one shot, even if of course the enemy may avoid that, right? And that's exactly the point of many, but still it's not a matter of strategical choice. It's probably what also the enemy would revert to, passing from think about guerrilla, think about Bien Den Phu, for example, or those major battles that occurred after years of minor engagements that eventually aim at knocking the enemy out with this major concentration of forces that for the outcome that it can have, it can't overwhelm just from a moral point of view, not even about the physical the psychophysical destruction you can unleash to troops who participate in that battle, but properly the moral consequence that it has at a strategical political level, right? That may be more useful than in fact the combat in itself, right? So that's why we should aim at that, because the moral effects in this case play always a greater force, and tendentially the humans tend to be discouraged, right, rather than encouraged by the everything in the balance, and therefore a great defeat adds to the single destruction happening in combat. This trail, this consequence of of disheartenment, I do not say that, but of properly of astonishment that adds, that breaks the spirit, the morale, right, and brings more difficulties to the defeated. Even though the situation maybe is not so desperate to say, okay, well, we got that, it was pretty, we don't want to be there again, right? And this passes through essentially the recognition of the enemy's superiority in some way, at least in those circumstances it can't repeat. And these circumstances, they are the big battle, and therefore it is the greater effort that you can make. Well, that's where the moral force strikes the greatest, because it says we have to do that all over again and risking to be defeated, right? And that's what brings, generally speaking, in fact, ideally, to the war to be decided. So naturally, this happens strategically through a series of encounters, of combat units, as von Clausewitz calls it, of tactical outcomes that altogether bring to the greater strategical consequence. But it's better in this case not necessarily to get it done as quickly as possible for the sake of, you could also not want to do that in relative terms, exactly because it would be too risky at some levels. But still, the concentration of enemy forces can take you out in detail, so you have to take it forcefully in consideration as an option, because the alternative may be being destroyed without even creating essentially the greatest force in relative terms you could ever put out there to contrast the enemy at some point. So this is naturally complicated by the limitations brought to reality, to the conduct of war, but it's still valid tendentially in war per se, in real terms. So von Clausewitz says, okay, we ended this. So the combat is the center of gravity. The decisive battle, center of gravity of the war. Right? And he writes, this has an influence on the manner of its decision, on the effect of the victory contained in it and determines the value which theory is to assign to it as a means to an end. Right? On that account, we make it the subject of our special consideration at this stage before we enter upon the special ends which may be bound up with it, but which do not essentially alter its character of it, if it, really deserves to be termed a battle. If a battle takes place principally on its own account, the elements of its decision must be contained in itself. In other words, victory must be striven for as long as possibility or hope remains. It must not therefore be given up on account of secondary circumstances, but only and alone in the event of the forces appearing completely insufficient. This is particularly important, because it's basically saying the decisive battle, of course, is, puts the higher stake of the whole campaign, right? If it is really the greater battle you're fighting. So the point of fighting it should be, as we've seen, the primary object of the war, right? And this means, by definition, that secondary objects, albeit altogether they do not form this greater object that can tell you, look, you're not strong enough, should be going for it, unless, in fact, conversely, the forces are not sufficient, right? So it's always fundamentally about that, and it's not an easy decision. It's not easy to determine, right? It can be really, difficult to measure that, and that's probably why this battle is so important, because it invests so much for a much higher risk, right? But there is also a human tendency, and this is what von Clausewitz is also concerned with, that aside from the rationale that should figure out, right, how, not just the rationale, but also intuition and genius more properly, what the ratio of forces really is, when you fight against the enemy in the broader campaign for this decisive battle, but properly be aware that fooling around too much, wasting time, diverting, belating the battle, if there is no really good reason for it, is enormously damaging, right? Because the whole thing costs a freaking lot in the first place, and you should, according to von Clausewitz, simply go out there and give that punch straight in the face without any form of warning, right? And if you think about it, that's pretty much realistic, right? That's what really strikes and kills, right? Best soldiers in this sense, it's because they are trained exactly to do it, not to waste time, like in action movies before killing someone. Go there, kill, right? Without winking. And that's what that's probably a moral matter, right? Troops are trained, generals are trained equal to think that, not to lose themselves into unnecessary decision, not to be in perspective being tricked by something that seemed to be particularly important. Instead, it is not at all. Von Clausewitz says, if a battle takes place principally on its own account, the elements of its decision must be contained in itself. And von Clausewitz writes, now how is that precise moment to be described? That is, when is that we know properly? In this sense, probably in the decisive battle itself, when the moment has come to get out of there, right, in time, given what it is at stake, right? And this is a terrifying decision, because of course you're there in order to win, but if you start realizing things are going to be likely wrong, you should put into account that on your decision, especially as a commander, depends a freaking lot about what that eventual defeat from your side is going to be, right? Because as we have seen, actually the most important consequences of the battle depend also on probably the losses that have been gained, usually after the fighting proper, right? So during the pursuit and so on. And there is a lot of interaction here to calculate. It is to say, for example, how many troops should I commit to the fight more? Will this allow others to escape freely? If not, how long should I resist? And all this, always thinking, actually, at all times, like, how is it gonna end? Like, because the point is it's difficult to determine, especially the greater the battle is, what all the proportions involved, the forces involved are. And also, as von Clausewitz now will explain, you may realize that you're gonna lose in a moment in which, I don't know, maybe the enemy has not even realized it, in which you have also lots of forces to spare, still, right? So, in a situation that concretely, you don't have like cent security of properly losing, and that just by the engagement, by the rage, by the tension, you're hoping to save at some point. So there is a limit, as we will see, between trying to do that in terms of there is also some positive resistance you hand to on the field, and this all depends on your strategical goal, right? It could be actually positive to die till the to everybody to the end, killing as many enemies as possible, but also how concretely realizable is that, right? We know that normally it doesn't happen like it. At least there is always maybe some unit that fights to the death. Actually, it happens all the time, especially to cover the reserve. Excuse me, the retreat of other units. But generally speaking, still there is a major collapse in which that resistance also will be somewhat diluted, right? And so you have to think about timing, about what the other options there. Of course, these are all things you should have thought about before the battle, especially given that the decisive battle is not just an extemporary engagement you just happen to find yourself into without realizing. There are situations that, of course, the smaller the battle is in this sense, and the more, in fact, it depends on the strategic context as well, because you may have just a very tiny force to control enormous theater. There are lots of examples we could make here from military history as well, but generally speaking, the larger the battle is, and the more you have planned that, the more you have time to say, okay, to think about all the options, and you should have considered that very, very carefully. Right, albeit what can happen in there is very difficult to determine, in fact, what is going on. And that's why von Clausewitz concentrates properly on the tactical moment of this decision, because that's the only moment in which you can properly test it, generally speaking. And the larger the battle is, also the more sensible, generally speaking, it is as an engagement, right? And the more uncertain it is, right? Or better, from one side it's more the odds are more evenly balanced, right? But exactly for this reason, you don't properly know how bad that can turn. Whereas in smaller engagements, there are absurd things that can happen. Even the small units, in dramatic numerical inferiority can't do miracles. In larger battles, in proportion, that chances decreases dramatically, right? So it's always and there is way more at stake, as we've seen. So von Clausewitz says, if a certain artificial formation and cohesion of an army is the principal condition under which the bravery of the troops can gain a victory, as was the case during great part of the period of the modern art of war, then the breaking up of this formation is the decision. A beaten wing which is put out of joint decides the fate of all that was connected with it. If, as was the case at another time, the essence of the defense consists in an intimate alliance of the army with the ground on which it fights and its obstacles, so that army and position are only one, then the conquest of an essential point in the position is the decision. It is said the key of the position is lost, it cannot therefore be defended any further, the battle cannot be continued. In both cases, the beaten armies are very much like the broken strings of an instrument which cannot do their work, right? And von Clausewitz points out these two dimensions about properly the formation and the terrain, as fundamentally as the art of war was thought gravitating around concerning tactics. That, of course, is not ruled out from modern war, but let's say it's not. It was thought previously to be fundamentally all about that, right? In a somewhat static essence that, compared at least to modern developments, That of course was functional to that type of warfare. We've seen in previous videos that fundamentally in ancient medieval times, the army and its composition was all about what the war revolved around in many ways, and therefore naturally also how it performed in the field properly as a unit, right, mattered concretely. Later on, it was also a matter of calculating. Think about the Renaissance with the introduction of firearms on a large scale. It began something, to be more. It kind of slowed down. It kind of, in a sense, right? This major pike formations were difficult to take down. It took 200 years actually to dilute that completely. And also the importance of the field in that sense was said, okay, if you can't hold that position, it's like there's not much we can do about it. And if you hold that position, it's won, right? This is not like completely true even for these eras, right? The thing is way more complex, and in fact, actually, what von Clausewitz describes for the Napoleonic era in many ways is valid for warfare broadly meant. Von Clausewitz is just saying that, to be aware that this, focusing exclusively on these two sides of the story, like the formation or the control of a certain point of the battlefield, is a reductive way of conceiving especially for a great battle, the concerted use of forces, for the greater end, right? And we've seen that fundamentally since Hellenistic times. We know that a synergic employment of all the single units that form your army is to a single end, right? Is properly the way to win a war. And after Cannae, not that much is being reintroduced in this sense. Von Clausewitz limits himself to realize that in his time, naturally, the battlefields have become larger, more complicated, and therefore this synergic use and of forces and the increased, let's say, complication, generally speaking, of the unfolding of combat have shown to get altogether the much greater complexity, right? For which we shouldn't be fixated about. It's just about a matter of deployment and not what to do with it. For example, it's just about controlling the spot in the field and not minding about the other things that happen around it. So because forces could still, enemy forces could still surprise you in many ways, and this is just to confine the problem to the forces that are present in the field at the moment of battle. So it's very complex, and that's why this video naturally is connected to all the others that we have seen up to this point. And von Clausewitz writes that geometrical as well as this geographical principle, which had a tendency to place an army in a state of crystallizing tension, which did not allow of the available powers being made use of up to the last man, have at least so far lost their influence that they no longer predominate. Right? Armies are still led into battle in a certain order, but that order is no longer of decisive importance. Obstacles of ground are also still turned to account to strengthen their position, but they are no longer the only support. Right? The modern battlefield is dramatically more dynamic. There's much more firepower, much more powerful strengths involved in the first place. So it's actually, this dynamicization, let's say, passes properly through also the idea that you shouldn't simply sit there and think that you can just hold your ground. There is this much more accelerated need to attack and to defense, pass to counterattack, and unleashing. And there's all an economy even here of fire, of reserves, as we've seen broadly speaking. And so the question is, the settlement is a much longer matter here that really must take into consideration way more factors than just the single ones. Von Clausewitz writes, we attempted in the second chapter of this book to take a general view of the nature of the modern battle. According to our conception of it, the order of battle is only a disposition of the forces suitable to the convenient use of them, and the course of the battle a mutual slow wearing away of these forces upon one another, to see which all have soonest exhausted his adversary. Right? So here repeats what we've seen previously about this attritional kind of battle, fundamentally, as von Clausewitz describes the one in Napoleonic times, and stressing the importance of the reserves and the even the time proper that it takes to realize what is going on. That it doesn't make it easier, because if pre-industrial time, pre-antiquity and Middle Ages, you just know what you have in front of you. It's somewhat easier to understand what is going on, right? In Napoleonic times, it wasn't. There is probably a matter of problem of visibility, of knowing where the enemy forces are, how much are there, how many are coming yet. So I think it's way more complicated. It can't be settled just controlling this ever new becoming that you have to keep an eye on constantly to decide whatever you have to do. Then von Clausewitz writes, the resolution, therefore, to give up the fight arises in a battle more than in any other combat, from the relation of the fresh reserves remaining available, for only these still remain all their moral vigor, and the cinders of the battered, knocked out battalions already burnt out in the destroying element must not be placed on a level with them. Also lost ground, as we have elsewhere said, is a standard of lost moral force, if therefore comes also into account, but more as a sign of loss suffered than the loss itself, and the number of fresh reserves is always the chief point to be looked at by both commanders. Right here basically sums up what we have already seen. We're talking about the importance of reserve and ground control as probably an indicator of the balance of in modern warfare, what battles are going, like the combat is going. And here von Clausewitz stresses the fact that naturally commanders should always look at that and saying, evaluating mostly on those two parameters, as we've already seen. Then von Clausewitz goes on and says, in general, an action inclines in one direction from the very commencement, but in a manner little observable, right? So this is actually intuitive, right? Every time you begin a battle, of course, the first shot that kills someone, it's like one guy out of there from one side, a bit of gunpowder and ammo from the other, right? So there is always the balance that existed at the beginning. In every single moment is actually modified, and the combat in itself, as a violent moment of destruction, naturally accelerates this change. And it's, I would say, almost it's always perceptible. There are always signs of that, at least. It's not necessarily easy to quantify, but it always goes on, right? And von Clausewitz says, this direction is also frequently given in a very decided manner by the arrangements which have been made previously, right? So this is properly to take into consideration as well in the plan, right? If you deploy your troops in a unfavorable way, those are going to suffer during the battle. So it may probably not have to do with much what the genius inventive of the commander, the ability of its troops have on the field, but just the mistake you made in the plan, right? And it says, von Clausewitz says also, and then it shows a want of discernment in that general who commences battle under these unfavorable circumstances without being aware of them, right? So it's not much of a great general, the one that doesn't pre-arrange the deployment in a way that that is convenient for him during such an important battle, right? So this, however, tends to happen less in major battles, because it takes this kind of selection that takes the best generals to get to the point, tendentially, and the greatest capacities properly. But von Clausewitz says, even when this does not occur, right? And it always occurs, because no deployment is perfect. There is something you can't even properly calculate. It probably doesn't even, maybe as not so important, for example, as much as the ability of the troops at that point, but it still counts, right? If you just take the deployment, there's always one side that had it better, the other had it worse, right? And von Clausewitz says, it lies in the nature of things that the course of a battle resembles rather a slow disturbance of equilibrium, which commences soon, as we've seen, but as we have said, almost imperceptibly at first, and then with each moment of time becomes stronger, more visible, than an oscillating to and fro, and those who are misled by mendacious descriptions usually suppose. Right? This is important. This graduality in it. Right? The fact that normally also, lighter, cheaper troops engage first. Right? That prepare the battle, prepare the ground. Think about the skirmishers. Cavalry trying to flank one another, making these attempts, feint flights, and so on. But it's eventually the two armies get engaged. They probably engage each other, and at that point, the attrition starts to be higher, and you start seeing properly what is going on. You can start almost perceiving the resistance of your own troops, and the ones of the enemy as well. And there is a back and forth, as Vom Kriege puts it here. Like there's not a linear tendency. There are battles that are easily there's a moment in which one did better, one did worse, right? And naturally, the more complicated, the larger this battle is, and the more it's likely going to be so easily, right? Vom Kriege says, but whether it happens that the balance is for a long time little disturbed, or that even after it has been lost on one side, it rights itself again, and is then lost on the other side, it is certain that all events that in most instances the defeated general foresees his fate long before he retreats, and that cases in which some critical events act with unexpected force upon the course of the wall have their existence mostly in the coloring with which everyone depicts his lost battle, right? This is very important because it touches 2 points. The first one is fundamentally the fact that there are battles, usually the bloodiest ones, the ones that are more balanced since the beginning in many ways, because there's a lot of quality from both sides, a lot of force from both sides, that are maintained, evenly balanced till the very end, right? This still doesn't mean that, let's say, a broader complex of forces in this regard is not already telling you, look, for now, maybe you have enough forces engaged that are balancing the thing, but maybe you don't have many more out there, and that properly is what matters, also considering the wall forces and the reserves in the border sense. So it's difficult sometimes to do that, because until the reserve is not engaged, it's also difficult to test that and the effect that it can have. But on the other hand, for Clausewitz, it's looked at not only generals generally foresee, of course, the outcome of the battle before it happens, but it is achieved, right? But also that their opinion about it, their impression about it, their judgment about it, may actually be wrong, right? May, or at least may influence the same engagement of the battle itself. So there is an enormous responsibility from the command to say, what is that we are doing? Like, are we doing the best we can to measure exactly the odds, right, and how things will go in the end? Which, in any case, it's what the two contendants are fundamentally interested in as their primary object, and especially in the decisive battle. Von Clausewitz says, we can only here appeal to the decision of unprejudiced men of experience who will, we are sure, assent to what we have said, and answer for us to such of our readers as do not know war from their own experience. To develop the necessity of discourse from the nature of the thing would lead us too far into the province of tactics, to which this branch of the subject belongs. We are here only concerned with its results properly, right? So Von Clausewitz is saying, we have now to be concretely focusing on what really, should concern the commander about the ultimate outcome of the battle, not much in how this is going to be achieved tactically speaking, which we'll see at some other point practically, and that other military experts, first-hand experts, can relate to up to regarding to what we have said up to this point, so that we can evidence properly what are the effects of a better or worse decision relatively to the moment that takes to abandon combat in this situation. Von Clausewitz writes, if we say that the defeated general foresees the unfavorable result, usually some time before he makes up his mind to give up the battle, we admit that there are also instances to the contrary, because otherwise we should maintain a proposition contradictory in itself. If at the moment of each decisive tendency of a battle should be considered as lost, then also no further forces should be used to give it a turn, and consequently this decisive tendency could not precede the retreat by any length of time. Right? So it's obvious that if you still have enough forces in this gradual, especially attritional combat, that could subvert the result. Maybe the thing is not going so well, but still you have enough troops you rely on to say, okay, we can still make something. In fact, that's why von Clausewitz skips properly the tactical details, because it said, how that is going to be achieved. It's a matter of who, has been on the field, knows more or less how it could be practically obtained. But let's focus in on the fact that still there is a moment in which, of course, things can go worse, and the general can say, well, that's not good news, but still has remained there and can legitimately think still to make it after all, right? And this can also lead to disaster, and there is no certainty in this regard. Von Clausewitz writes, certainly there are instances of battles which, after having taken a decided turn to one side, have still ended in favor of the other, but they are not usual, right? This is also a very powerful indicator. Like, if things start to go wrong, there is a reason and an effect in there that will likely, that by definition increases chances in your, to your disadvantage, right? That's kind of obvious. If you think about the odds, like a bar, at the beginning of the battle, it's like around 50-50 proportionally. Then things starts going from your side just 40%, 30%. Well, you still can make it, surely, but it becomes ever more difficult to, right? Because it says, these exceptional cases, however, are reckoned upon by every general against whom fortune declares itself, and he must reckon upon them as long as there remains a possibility of a turn of fortune. He hopes by stronger efforts, by raising the remaining moral forces, by surpassing himself, or also by some fortunate chance that the next moment will bring a change, and pursues this as far as his courage and his judgment can agree. We shall have something more to say on this subject, but before that we must show what are the signs of the scales turning. So let's pause probably to see, what are things that, can look at and say, wow, that's not very good. It's a sum of things, we'll see in a while. Clausewitz writes, the result of the whole combat consists in the sum total of the results of all partial combats, as we have already seen many times, but these results of separate combats are settled by different considerations. First, by the pure moral power in the mind of the leading officers. Right here, there is a dramatic centrality in the decisions of command. Command is crucial, it's one of the single most important factors, if not the greatest, at least for what concerns properly the art of war. Right? That is to say, who is in fact waging war and ordering and commanding and so on. If Clausewitz makes the example of sense, if a general of division has seen his battalion's forced to succumb, it will have an influence on his demeanor and his reports. Right? He's going to refer to that. Look, here things are going pretty bad, and this again will have an influence on the measure of the commander-in-chief. Therefore, even those unsuccessful partial combats, which to all appearance are retrieved, are not lost in their results. Right? And the impressions from them sum themselves up in the commander without much trouble and even against his will. That is to say, there is a balance, of course, right? A balance between what you think you still can do, and of course also here probably the actual chain of command, like what kind of control you have on your troops, is a dramatically important thing. But properly here, von Clausewitz is stressing rightfully the impression that the officers, generally speaking, report to the commander that naturally is not there all the time on the field, like doesn't see all of it necessarily, and therefore has to rely on these communications and says, maybe he can't even disagree. Like, how can he know that this is actually true? Of course, he relies on these men, but he knows them also. He knows what they're capable to at some point in, if they're reliable or not, what kind of people that they are, also from a moral point of view, to express these judgments. And yet, this has an influence on him. That is to say, just let's make an example that, I don't know, there may be an officer that brings the commanders down by telling him such bad news. Maybe if he just didn't tell, would spur the commander to take an action that otherwise he would have not taken, right? And that may be overall decisive, maybe for the entire course of the engagement. So here the point of communication of information is of dramatic importance because it reflects on the decisions of the commanders as well. And this is probably to do, and here Clausewitz says, the pure moral power in the mind of the leading officers. Right? That is to say that these men are meant to actually not to give up so easily, because after all, they are not the ones in command. They have just to obey the orders coming from the above. So technically, their duty there is to resist till as much as they can. Right? That's what all the martial, the discipline is about. You can't give up so easily, and you have to obey the orders if necessary, even with paying with your life. So the moral power is of huge importance, right? Because you may even find a weak person that freaks out, says, let's go out here. It happens all the time, right? And it gives a false information, gives a poor judgment in this case, and other people have to depend on him, right? This happens many times in many branches of life, just normally, and it's a matter properly of individual responsibility that requires not just a discipline, of course, but properly moral forces. That is to say, you have to hold on, right? You can't give up easily, or at least you have to have a very good reason for it that is proportionate to the situation. Then, secondly, von Clausewitz says, by the quicker melting away of our troops, right, which can't be easily estimated in the slow and relatively little tumultuary course of our battles. So this is relatively less controllable, and it's generally speaking something you can't. You can't blame the units for at some levels, but at the same time you don't have much control on, and you kind of know what those units are made of. And it's kind of a collective thing. It doesn't necessarily... it's all intertwined. These factors are all intertwined. So even the officer there has his own responsibility. But generally speaking, that's something at least less controversial. Like, that unit broke, okay? So, yeah, that's it. When it happens, you know it, and there is not much you can do after all. You can try to reunite them, to regroup them. But, once they have abandoned their post, usually it's because they have lost ground, and as we've seen, that's one, together with the presence of reserves still intact, that's the major indicator of the progress of a battle. Thirdly, in fact, by lost ground, which is a consequence, right? Units may even maintain their cohesion, but for example, go back. Not necessarily, kind of retreating, but still being intact and ready to fight, abandoning the position temporarily, right? So these three elements are all very important because they are actually, from the above, from the commander's visual, what he gets, like cognitively speaking. He receives his officers' reports. He sees which units break, and he can see which ground is lost, right? So these are a very important mean of judgment. It's fundamentally what all you can know. So von Clausewitz says, all these things serve for the eye of the general as a compass to tell the course of the battle in which he is embarked. If wall batteries have been lost and none of them taken, if battalions have been overthrown by the enemy's cavalry, whilst those of the enemy everywhere present impenetrable masses, if the line of fire from his order of battle wavers involuntarily from one point to another, if fruitless efforts have been made to gain certain points, and the assaulting battalions each time being scattered by well-directed volleys of grape and case, if our artillery begins to reply feebly to that of the enemy, if the battalions under fire diminish unusually fast because with the wounded crowds of unwounded men go to the rear, if single divisions have been cut off and made prisoners through the disruption of the plan of the battle, if the line of retreat begins to be endangered, the commander may tell very well in which direction he's going with his battle. Right? So this gives you picturesquely, I would say, the dimension of how complicated the development of this battle can really be. Right? There's not just one thing that, of course these results have also their own intensity, right? But this is kind of still before the major break, right? So these are kind of the hints, the first signals that things are going badly, right? All together. These things can still happen in a victorious army in a battle, right? But once again, you have to determine that. Generally speaking, they're not good signs, obviously. So Von Clausewitz says, the longer this direction continues, so you see here, it's a matter of time. You've seen it's battle attrition, so our troops are meant to melt away, right? There is probably a destruction is going on, right? It costs properly to destroy enemy forces in terms of, with the destruction of your row, through the destruction of your row, right? So this is normal in many ways. But the point is, where is it going to go ultimately? Well, the longer this direction continues, von Clausewitz writes, the more decided it becomes. So much the more difficult will be the turning. So much the nearer the moment when he must give up the battle. Right? This is dramatically important because it makes you realize that the more this goes on, in a negative sense, and the more difficult the situation, with greater difficulty the situation can be reversed. So there is probably, it's important to stress that here we're skipping every other tactical implication, like how can you reverse the thing? There is you must know that, and it's a technicality that we cannot take into consideration because every battle is different, and of course there are similar things that can happen on the field, but still, that's the genius, that's the talent every time. It's based on these calculations, but it naturally also it goes through action proper to certain maneuvers and so on. But the point here is that it's mostly a regressive process, right? It's ever more difficult to do something with the forces you have at your disposal, the more, of course, they are worn out. So in many ways, you could theoretically avoid the disaster by simply disengaging as soon as you see that things are going bad, but still, that's going to be a disaster. And there's still a chance the thing may be reversed. So it's actually a very controversial decision to do in the first place, because people are going to die anyway, and the matters are going to unfold very seriously in any case. And still the whole thing has to pass through destruction, a bloody outcome, and actually also the reversal of the situation still contemplates that not only you have lost forces before, but also you need other forces to be spent in order to reverse it. So that gives you the idea of the decay, of the physical decay of the system proper, right? There is a chaos that is spreading, and you can't put that together tactically speaking at some point anymore. We've seen it in previous chapters. So von Clausewitz writes, we have already said more than once that the final decision is ruled by the relative number of fresh reserves remaining at the last. Right. So here, this other aspect of the reserves that represent in many ways the other major indicator where how many chances you have, how many other troops you can use to try to bring the battle to a favorable outcome, favorable ending. So Clausewitz writes, that commander who sees his adversary is decidedly superior to him in this respect makes up his mind to retreat. It is characteristic of modern battles that all mischances and losses which take place in the course of the same can be retrieved by fresh forces, because the arrangement of the modern order of battle and the way in which troops are brought into action allow of their use almost generally and in each position. Right? It is to say, in modern battles, it's relatively easy, after all, to make troops intervene in another area of the field, right? This is true the larger the battlefield is, and in this sense, even maybe the larger the units are, because we've seen fundamentally that the disadvantages deriving from these movements are mostly in their tactical dimension. The larger the units are, the more they approach the strategical dimension, they're easier to move. Like, even the importance of reserves in this regard is, they're quick. Larger troops are quicker to be deployed, right? As the more distant they are from the fight, the more room they have, generally speaking, this broader battle, not properly ground, but this space of movement that exists in the rear, right, in one and another. So this is to be thought in the sense, of course, of larger Napoleonic battles that were growing much bigger in this sense than what had ever been seen before, whereas previously the situation would have been more complicated. Because the space is increased, right? So also the maneuvers became easier for the same. Humans remain the same size, so but the problem, the greatness, of the units increased. So long, therefore, as that commander against whom the issue seems to declare itself still remains a superiority in reserve force, he will not give up the day, right? So tendentially, of course, if you have still fresh reserves, and you know that you can theoretically put up once again a good fight, well, that is a good reason, after all, to avoid losing that battle and spending those forces, because what have you brought them for otherwise, right? And Clausewitz says, though, but from the moment that his reserves begin to become weaker than the enemy's, the decision may be regarded as settled, and what he now does depends partly on special circumstances, partly on the degree of courage and perseverance which he personally possesses, and which may degenerate into foolish obstinacy. Because reserves are not infinite in that regard, as we have seen, the more you spend them, and the more the situation becomes difficult to reverse if things are going bad. So there is von Clausewitz gives that there is probably a merit in deciding darkly, right, with a great responsibility, because people are going to die because of your choice, direct choice, that to continue the fight, right? But and that can be praised because you don't give up at the first difficulty, and you still think you can properly do something about it, properly in a tactical sense, like you have something, hopefully you have a plan in mind. But in fact, there is the limit, in fact, between this and is that just foolish obstinacy that actually can present itself very frequently on the battlefield, because you don't want to lose it, right? You think you still can't send a reserve here, a reserve there, and you don't realize you have already lost, right? And that it would have been better actually try to retreat in good order as much as you could, rather than making those units ending up destroyed anyway, right? So von Clausewitz writes, how a commander can attain to the power of estimating correctly the still remaining reserves on both sides is an affair of skillful practical genius, which does not in any way belong to this place, right? We're not discussing it now. We keep ourselves to the result as it forms itself in his mind, but this conclusion is still not the moment of decision properly, for a motive which only arises gradually does not answer to that, but is only a general motive towards resolution. And the resolution itself requires still some special immediate causes. Of these, there are two chief ones which constantly occur. That is, the danger of the retreat and the arrival of the night. Right? These are two important factors that are naturally about, as we were saying before, you can even decide to retreat, but you may actually be in difficult in a difficult situation even for doing that. We've seen even, for example, the difficulty of the terrain. You may think, if I escape there's a mountain close, the forest close to the battlefield, I retreat there, it's safer, easier. Actually, that is not, right? It may be in a short term, but in a longer term, actually it's better to have a very well open way where you can retreat and escape far and wide. So at some point you could simply say, if I don't die on the battlefield, I will likely die on the retreat because someone will kill me, as it normally happens, right? Because of course most people get properly killed or at least captured. Well, that depends also, but during the pursuit, and therefore, like, you may think, okay, I prefer to stand my ground and die here rather than, and so that I can maybe inflict even more losses to the enemy than, of course, die later. But such a decision is not something that every person can take. Most people will simply flee, even if they perfectly know they will die afterwards, because at the moment that they break, they don't have any, they're broken psychophysically, right? So these are also some aspects, of course, overall cannot be controlled, but still it's important for the general to have decided before, in case. Also, the arrival of the night is important because obscurity helps tendentially with fleeing. So that may be calculated in a kind of quantitative way, that is to say, okay, before sounding the retreat, let's wait for the night, and that is a good, like, you may have actually wanted to fight just before the late afternoon. Many battles are fought late in the day exactly because of this, so that especially the decisive ones, they say that maybe do not have it, which is not a necessarily positive thing, because it means that you still fear you could lose. It's not a great moral indicator in that sense, but at the same time, they may be a good way to say, okay, we will at least not have our entire forces destroyed, as if they were pursued in case of defeat in daylight, where the enemy can see where you are at a greater distance and so on. And Clausewitz explains this and says, if the retreat with every new step which a battle takes in its course becomes constantly in greater danger, and if the reserves are so much diminished that they are no longer adequate to get breathing room, also because that could be a case, then there is nothing left but to submit to fate, and by a well-conducted retreat to save what by a longer delay ending in flight and disaster would be lost. Right, so there is still naturally an orderly retreat that can be carried out. It's not much of a matter of choice, right? Most of the times you really can't, but at least there are some units that can't get out of the field, let's say, more easily than others. This is kind of evident. Just think about cavalry, for example. But that's not properly the entire thing here. It really means about the order that an entire unit can maintain. Right? There are, during Napoleonic times, if I'm not wrong, after Jena, it was a Saxon battalion that retreated from the field, pursued by French cavalry. I don't know if it was French or Allied, I don't know, but in square. We have evidence of that. Right, so just think about it, just also saying that the square is not just a static formation. But that's one of those situations that show you that, and that the battalion saved itself, right? So it's quite fascinating. So that's a good example of what Von Clausewitz is talking about, and he probably had it in his mind, given that, he was pretty much involved in this. And Von Clausewitz also adds about the knight, but knight as a rule puts an end to all battles, because a knight combat holds out no hope of advantage except under particular circumstances. And as knight is better suited for a retreat than the day, so therefore the commander must look at the retreat as a thing inevitable, or as most probable, will prefer to make use of the knight for this purpose. We have already explained it. That there are, Clausewitz writes, besides the above two usual and chief causes, yet many others also, right, which are less or more individual and not to be overlooked, is a matter of course. Furthermore, a battle tends towards a complete upset of equilibrium, the more sensible is the influence of each partial result in hastening the turn. Thus, the loss of a battery, a successful charge of a couple of regiments of cavalry, may call into life the resolution to retreat already ripening. Right? As a conclusion to this subject, we must dwell for a moment on the point at which the courage of the commander engages in a sort of conflict with this reason. Right? Because this thing of the command is still central. Right? First of all, what we just wrote, we read in the previous paragraph was about the idea that, of course, the more the odds are turning in your favor, and the more you should try to do a bit what you have done at a strategical level to search for the greater battle. That is, to concentrate more forces at that point where the enemy is weaker, so that you can crash in him at the moment. So it's actually very important. And instead, than waiting, for example, for him to escape, right? So there is part of the reason why naturally the unfavorable odds are more difficult to revert is that the enemy will use that advantage to oppress you further, right? And never, always concentrate on moral forces in this regard. It's not even a physical thing. It's about properly making realizing these people are not, mankind, right? They have their own mindset on what the battle is turning like. So not everybody's a hero that wants to get killed right there. So it's not even about how much fire the enemy can pour on you. It's probably the expectation of it has an impact, right? So that's extremely important. If you start having that advantage on the field, press on, because that you can actually have an enormous benefit, right? And that's why von Clausewitz says also, consider that if instead things are going bad for you, try to retreat in time, because the enemy is going to do exactly that at that point. Even if that means to finally say, okay, it's over, we lost it, with all the moral disadvantage that will unfold. This is dramatically important, because there's no way out of there, right? This is properly what crushes most, even of the workamistic prejudices that exist out here. This is all a psychological thing, largely, right? It's not about which kind of finesse or tactical sophistication of weapons, whatever. It's about properly realizing this is a clash between wills, right? And there is no way to subvert certain situations, to turn them. Anyhow, and von Clausewitz, as we've seen here now, comes back on the decision of the commander, and also makes a terribly bitter remark about Napoleon at Waterloo. He writes, if on the one hand the overbearing pride of a victorious conqueror, if the inflexible will of a naturally obstinate spirit, if the strenuous resistance of noble feelings would not yield the battlefield, where they must leave their honor, yet on the other hand reason counsels not to give up everything, not to risk the last upon the game, but to retain as much over as is necessary for an orderly retreat. However highly we must esteem courage and firmness in a war, and however little prospect there is of victory to him who cannot resolve to seek it by exertion of all his power, still there is a point beyond which perseverance can only be termed desperate folly, and therefore can meet with no approbation from any critic. In the most celebrated of all battles, that of Belle Alliance, Bonaparte used his last reserve in an effort to retrieve a battle which was past being retrieved. He spent his last farthing, and then as a beggar abandoned both the battlefield and his crown. Right, and here we're of course talking about the engagement of the Old Guard. Its annihilation later on, and more generally, this, we can say specifically tunnel vision, but properly the desperation. Like this is the problem of it all, right? These are not experiences that a normal mind can can't take, right? You know, normal people would get crushed just by the sheer responsibility of leading these troops. And you can imagine what are the feelings of a commander that sees, you know, his entire empire, in this case, destroyed in a single battle. Right? It's terrifying, it's devastating, it cannot be properly expressed in words. So this in here Von Clausewitz seems to make actually a, you know, he of course talks about the obstinacy, the mistake, but probably it's of Napoleon, but he's probably telling us, look, that the guy who was the greatest military mind of his times broke at that point. So if he did, you can't think about others, right? This is particularly important to stress, right? It's not easy to regard, and generally speaking, there is this words really reveal you what at the end of the day this whole thing is, right? You know, war is that level of devastation, right? It's unspeakable for anybody who has never been there, cannot understand it, right? I can't say that you can understand it, you know, if you read the Vom Kriege, but you can understand, you can sense on the base of what you think it's the worst thing can happen to you, that what happens in war is way worse than that. And von Clausewitz really is able to make you to transmit it to you, to say this is a serious business. You shouldn't underestimate in this regard. It's that bad. It's that devastating. It cannot be properly cancelled in this regard. It's really hard. However, this is the end. We made it to make one video. Next one is also long, but these videos are these chapters are very, very important, because von Clausewitz is approaching probably the most important topics of this whole theory, and around which the entire art of war revolves. Anyhow, for now we stop it here, and for which I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.